Welcome to this journey through one of the most disturbing cases recorded in the history of Victorian England. Before we begin, I invite you to leave in the comments where you are watching from and the exact time when you are listening to this narration. We are interested in knowing what places and at what times of day or night these documented accounts reach. In the first week of July 1860, the Trowbridge and North Wilts Advertiser printed a short notice concerning a sudden death in the village of Road on the Wiltshire and Somerset border. The article, little more than half a column, reported that the 3-year-old son of a respectable local family had been found dead in the grounds of his father's house, under circumstances the paper described as too shocking to detail at present. The correspondent closed by noting that the local constabulary had the matter in hand and that no suspicion of foul play from outside the household appeared to attach to the case. What the paper failed to mention, because nobody yet knew it, was that this brief notice would be the opening of one of the most disturbing criminal cases in English history, one that would consume the national press for 5 years, ruin the reputation of the finest detective of his generation, and leave a question hanging over an English country house that has never been fully answered. Road Hill House stood on the northern edge of the village of Road, a settlement of perhaps 900 souls on the road between Frome and Trowbridge, in the rolling country where Wiltshire gives way to the clothiers' valleys of Somerset. The property was a handsome 3-storey Georgian building of pale stone, set within its own walled grounds, with an orchard, a kitchen garden, a paddock, a gravel carriage drive, and a narrow lane running along its western boundary to the River Frome. The house had been the residence of the Kent family since 1855. By the summer of 1860, the master of the house was Samuel Savile Kent, aged 59, an inspector of factories for the Home Office, whose duties required him to travel across the West Country to check on compliance with the labour laws governing the woolen mills and cotton works of the region. Samuel Kent was a man of careful self-presentation. He dressed as a gentleman, kept a carriage, employed 3 live-in servants, and had lately installed high gates and fencing around the grounds to deter local boys from scrumping apples in the orchard. Neighbours noted that the gates were a fresh expense for a man whose income was known to be modest. County records show that Kent had moved his household 5 times in the previous 15 years, each move provoked in part by local gossip that followed him from parish to parish. In Sidmouth, in Walton Manor, in East Culston, in Bainton House, and now in Road, the same pattern had repeated. The Kents would arrive, establish themselves, attract whispers, and move on. The whispers concerned the second Mrs. Kent. Samuel's first wife, Mary Ann Winders, had been the daughter of a prosperous London coachmaker. She had borne 10 children in 15 years, and had died in May 1852, after a long decline that her husband and several physicians described as a failure of the mind. 3 months later, in August 1853, Samuel married Mary Drew Pratt, the family governess. Pratt had joined the household in the mid-1840s to care for the elder children, and had lived in the house throughout the final years of the first Mrs. Kent's illness. The gossip in each successive parish was the same. The second Mrs. Kent had been the first Mrs. Kent's rival long before she became her replacement. By the summer of 1860, the second Mrs. Kent was 40 years old, mother of 3 living children, and heavily pregnant with her 4th. The household at Road Hill House on the night of June 29th, 1860, consisted of 12 people. Samuel Kent and his wife Mary, slept in the principal bedroom on the first floor. 3 of the 4 children of the first marriage were at home. Mary Ann Alice, aged 29, and Elizabeth, aged 28, occupied a bedroom together on the upper floor. Constance Emily, aged 16, slept alone in a smaller room on the same floor. William Savile, aged 14, the only surviving son of the first marriage, slept in a bedroom nearby. Constance and William were home for the summer holiday from their respective boarding schools. The 3 children of the second marriage slept together with their nurse, Mary Amelia, aged 5, and Evelyn, aged 1, shared a nursery with Elizabeth Goff, the 22-year-old nursemaid, and in a cot between Goff's bed and the wall slept 3-year-old Francis Savile Kent, known in the family as Savile. The cook, Sarah Kerslake, aged 23, and the housemaid Sarah Cox, aged 22, slept in the attic story above. A watchdog called Nutty was loose in the yard, as was the practice every night on Samuel Kent's orders. Samuel was particular about the security of his grounds. Each evening before retiring, he personally checked that the shutters were fastened, the doors bolted, and the windows secure. The weather in the last week of June 1860 was unusually wet. Rain had fallen heavily on the 28th and 29th. The ground was soft, the paths muddy, the night air cool for the season. The household ate supper at the usual hour and retired in the usual manner. Elizabeth Goff later stated that she put Savile into his cot at about 8 o'clock, tucking him in with his small blanket between the sheet and the counterpane. The boy was, by all accounts, a bright and affectionate child, slightly small for his age, fond of his father, and a particular favourite of the household. At some point after midnight, Savile was taken from his cot. Elizabeth Goff, sleeping a few feet away, heard nothing. The other children did not stir. Samuel and Mary Kent, 1 floor below, heard nothing. The watchdog Nutty, loose in the yard, made no alarm. 2 poachers, who were that night fishing illegally in Samuel Kent's stretch of the River Frome, later told investigators that the dog had given only a few brief yelps around 1 or 2 in the morning, yelps of the kind the animal was known to produce at any small disturbance. They had thought nothing of it. Elizabeth Gove awoke shortly before 5 on the morning of June 30th. She later told investigators that when she saw Savile's cot empty, she assumed Mrs. Kent had come in during the night and taken the boy to her own bed, which was a practice not unknown in the household when the child was restless. Goff rose, dressed herself, attended to the younger children, and went about her usual morning duties. It was only some time after 7 when she knocked at Mrs. Kent's door to collect the boy that the misapprehension came to light. Mary Kent, heavily pregnant and still in bed, informed the nursemaid that Savile had not been with her at any point during the night. A search of the house began at once. The staircases, the attics, the outhouses, the orchard, the paddock, the carriage drive, all were examined by the family and the servants within the space of an hour. Samuel Kent gave orders to put the horses to the carriage and drove personally to Trowbridge, a distance of some 4 miles, to inform Superintendent John Foley of the Wiltshire Constabulary. He did this rather than sending a servant or a villager on horseback, a decision that struck several witnesses as curious at the time and would strike investigators as more curious later. While Samuel was on the road, a labourer named Thomas Benger and a shoemaker named William Nutt, both of whom lived in the village and had come to help with the search, made their way to the servants' privy in the shrubbery at the western end of the grounds. The privy was an outdoor closet of the kind common in country houses of the period, consisting of a small timber cabin built over a deep, stone-lined vault. William Nutt opened the door. The light from the small window above the seat fell on the floor, and he saw what he would later describe as a quantity of blood, perhaps 2 tablespoonfuls, on the flagstones. He called for Benger. Together the 2 men raised the wooden seat. In the vault below, wrapped in a blood-soaked blanket from his own cot, lay the body of Francis Savile Kent. His throat had been cut with such force that the head was nearly severed from the body. There was a separate wound to the chest. His small hands bore defensive cuts. A local physician, Joshua Parsons of Beckington, was summoned to the house within the hour. Parsons examined the body and concluded that the boy had been killed by a single deep cut across the throat, delivered with a sharp blade, most likely a razor. He estimated that death would have followed within seconds of the wound being inflicted. The investigation that followed was hampered, from the first hour, by the social position of the Kent family and by the limitations of rural policing in the mid-Victorian period. Superintendent Foley, when he arrived from Trowbridge with Samuel Kent, treated the master of the house as a gentleman first and a possible witness second. He confined his initial inquiries to the servants. He did not search the family's rooms. He did not seize any clothing. He permitted Samuel Kent to direct him to a clump of bushes at the rear of the property, where Samuel suggested the murderer might have waited. He examined the bushes, found nothing, and concluded that an intruder must have come and gone during the night. Foley would later admit, in testimony given to the magistrates in July, that during this first visit to the house, he had taken no notes of the layout of the bedrooms, no inventory of the laundry, and no statement from any member of the family above the age of 10. This early assumption that the killer had come from outside governed the local investigation for its first 2 weeks and allowed the most important physical evidence in the case to be lost. The laundry of the house was sent out on Monday, July 2nd, as it was each Monday, to a Mrs. Holly in the village. When the laundry was returned, 3 nightdresses belonging to the women of the household were listed on Mrs. Holly's accompanying book that were not among the linen she sent back. One of them was Constance Kent's. Mrs. Holly maintained then and later that the nightdress had been present in the bundle when she received it. The nightdress was never seen again. By the middle of July, the local press had filled with speculation, and the London papers had taken up the story. The Morning Post called it a crime without parallel in our criminal records. The Times printed a floor plan of Road Hill House on the 10th of July, reconstructed, as was revealed some days later, by a reporter from the Bath Chronicle who had gained entry to the property by representing himself as a detective. Samuel Kent offered a reward of £100 for information leading to the capture of the murderer. The magistrates, conscious that the local force was out of its depth, petitioned the Home Secretary for the assistance of Scotland Yard. On July 14th, Detective Inspector Jonathan Wiltshire arrived in Road. Jack Wiltshire, as he was known to his colleagues and to the readers of the penny papers, was 46 years old, London-born, a former plasterer's labourer who had joined the Metropolitan Police in 1837 and had been among the 8 original members of the detective branch when it was established at Scotland Yard in 1842. By 1860, he had solved a string of notable cases and was considered by Charles Dickens, who had profiled him in Household Words, the Prince of Detectives. Dickens described him as a shrewd, grave man, with a broad face and watchful eyes, short of stature and quiet in manner, who spoke only when he had something worth saying. Wiltshire had 2 weeks to solve the murder at Road Hill House. He would never fully recover from what took place in that fortnight. Wiltshire interviewed the servants. He interviewed the younger children. He walked the grounds. He measured the distance from the nursery to the drawing room window and from the drawing room window to the privy. He noted that the drawing room window had been found unshuttered on the morning of the 30th, that a pane of shutter was scored as though forced, but that the marks were on the wrong side to have been made from without. He noted that the watchdog had not barked. He noted that whoever had taken the child from his cot had removed him along with his blanket, an act that required composure and some knowledge of the household. He concluded, as any competent investigator of his generation would have concluded, that the murderer was a member of the household. The question was, which one? Wiltshire's attention settled on Constance Kent. The reasons he gave to the magistrates in his report of July 19th were precise. The missing nightdress, which had been in the laundry basket on Saturday morning and was unaccounted for by the following Monday. The testimony of the housemaid Sarah Cox, who said that Constance had retrieved her own nightdress from the laundry basket on the Monday morning, unassisted and without explanation. The pattern of Constance's behaviour since the murder, which those who lived with her described as calm to the point of coldness. The history of tension between Constance and her stepmother, which had driven the girl to run away from home at the age of 12 in the company of her younger brother William, both of them dressed in boys' clothing and bound for the coast, where Constance had told the boatmen she intended to take ship to Bristol and thence abroad. They had been caught at Bath and returned to their father. Wiltshire discovered, through careful questioning of the servants, that Constance had been punished for this episode by being confined to her room for long periods and by being sent away to boarding school at Beckington. He discovered further that the punishment for the running away had been inflicted at the instance of the second Mrs. Kent, and that Constance's resentment of her stepmother had taken root from that time. Wiltshire caused Constance Kent to be arrested on July 20th, 1860. She was held at Devizes House of Correction, then brought before the magistrates at Trowbridge on the 27th. What followed was a disaster for Wiltshire. The magistrates, under pressure from public opinion that had already formed around the image of a respectable young lady, accused on the word of a common policeman, gave Wiltshire 7 days to produce his evidence. The evidence he had was circumstantial and rested chiefly on the missing nightdress, which he could not produce, and on Sarah Cox's testimony, which was consistent but not conclusive. A barrister, Peter Edlin, engaged and paid for by Samuel Kent, dominated the proceedings. He reduced Wiltshire's case to ruins. The magistrates discharged Constance Kent on bail at the end of the 7 days. The case, the newspapers declared, had been a disgrace. Wiltshire, having come to the country at the invitation of the local authorities, was now the object of ridicule in every paper in England. He returned to London. He took a prolonged leave of absence. He submitted his resignation from the force in March 1864. He was 50 years old. The second arrest in the case was Elizabeth Gough. The local police, having convinced themselves that the murderer must, after all, have been a member of the household, and unwilling to accept Wiltshire's conclusions, settled instead on the nursemaid. Their theory, widely reported in the press, was that Gough had taken a lover into the house that night, that Savile had woken and witnessed the encounter, and that the lovers had killed the child to protect themselves. The rumour that the lover was Samuel Kent himself was repeated openly in the tap rooms of Frome and Trowbridge, and more quietly in the columns of the London weeklies. Gough was arrested on October 1st, 1860, and held at the same House of Correction at Devizes. The magistrates, presented with no evidence beyond suspicion, discharged her after 2 days. She left the county and returned to her family in Isleworth. She would not speak publicly of the case for the rest of her life. For nearly 5 years the matter rested. Samuel Kent left Roadhill House in the autumn of 1860, unable to bear the continued attention, and moved his household to Weston-super-Mare and later to Llangollen in Wales. The 2 children of the first marriage, who still remained at home, William and Constance, were sent away to schools. Constance was placed in a finishing school in the Paris suburb of Dinan, run by a Madame Bruguière. She remained there for 2.5 years. William, who had always been close to her, was sent to the naval school at the Royal Victoria Patriotic Asylum and later pursued studies in natural history at King's College London. The children of the second marriage grew. A boy, Acland Savile, was born 4 weeks after the murder. A girl, Florence Savile, was born in 1861. Of the murder itself, within the family, nothing was said. In the summer of 1863, Constance returned from France. She did not return to her father's household. She took rooms in Brighton and, some months later, presented herself at St Mary's Home in Queen Square, a house of refuge founded by a High Church clergyman named Arthur Douglas Wagner. Wagner, aged 39, was the perpetual curate of St Paul's Church in Brighton and a man of severe Anglo-Catholic conviction. St Mary's Home was his creation. It took in unmarried mothers, former prostitutes, and women seeking religious retreat. The regime was one of silence, obedience, and hard domestic work. Constance Kent entered it as a probationer, with particular responsibility for the care of the newly born infants of the penitents. She took the habit. She worked in silence. She lived among women whose names, in the records of the house, had been set aside for new names given in religion. In the early months of 1864, something happened at St Mary's that has never been fully explained. Constance, preparing for confirmation in the Anglican rite, applied to Reverend Wagner for his sponsorship. Wagner, having been informed of the episode in her past by the Lady Superior, Catherine Greme, refused. He told her that the shadow of the suspicion of murder remained upon her, and that until the shadow was lifted, he could not in conscience present her for confirmation. He conducted a series of private interviews with her. On the 3rd day of these interviews, Constance Kent confessed to the murder of her half-brother, Francis Savile Kent. On Tuesday, April the 25th, 1865, Reverend Wagner, accompanied by the Lady Superior Catherine Greme and by Constance Kent herself, travelled by train to London and presented themselves at Bow Street Magistrates' Court. The Chief Magistrate, Sir Thomas Henry, was handed a letter in Constance's own hand. It read in part, "I, Constance Emily Kent, alone and unaided, on the night of the 29th of June, 1860, murdered at Roadhill House, Wiltshire, one Francis Savile Kent. Before the deed no one knew of my intention, nor afterwards of my guilt. No one assisted me in the crime, nor in the evasion of discovery." Sir Thomas Henry, a magistrate of 30 years' experience, was visibly shaken. He questioned Constance closely as to whether she had given herself up of her own free will. He questioned Wagner and Greme as to whether any pressure, spiritual or temporal, had been brought to bear upon her. He remarked aloud that he was reluctant to receive a confession of this magnitude upon no further evidence than the prisoner's own statement. Constance, calm and composed throughout, confirmed the confession, signed it in his presence, and was remanded to Wiltshire. The trial took place at Salisbury Assizes on July 21st, 1865, before Mr. Justice Wills. Constance was represented by a barrister engaged by her father. She pleaded guilty. The judge, weeping as he pronounced sentence, ordered that she be hanged by the neck until she was dead. The Home Secretary, Sir George Grey, took the case in hand within days. Public feeling, which had turned sharply against Constance on the publication of her confession, had now turned again as the confession itself came to be examined. There was no blood on her. There was no nightdress. There was no second witness. There was a widely felt suspicion that she was shielding someone, most probably her brother William, and a suspicion also that Reverend Wagner, whose high church practices had long been the object of Protestant hostility in Brighton, had exercised some improper spiritual coercion. A mob gathered outside St. Mary's. The sisters were insulted in the street. Wagner himself was set upon and had a pistol discharged at him, the ball passing through his coat. The Home Secretary commuted the sentence to life imprisonment. Constance, aged 21, was committed to Millbank Prison in London. The substance of her confession, as given to the magistrates and later to the prison chaplain, was precise in its outline and silent as to its motive. She said that, on the night of the 29th of June 1860, after the household had retired, she had waited until she was certain all were asleep. She had gone downstairs to the drawing room, opened the shutters and the window, and left the window open behind her to give the appearance of an intrusion from outside. She had returned upstairs. She had entered the nursery where Elizabeth Gough slept, and had taken Savile from his cot, being careful to lift him with the blanket wrapped around him, so that the bedding would not be disturbed. She had carried him downstairs through the drawing room, out by the window, across the lawn, and into the servants' privy. She had taken with her a razor, which she had earlier removed from her father's dressing case. She had taken also a supply of matches, which she had hidden in the privy some days before. She had laid the child on the seat and cut his throat. She had then placed the body in the vault below. She had returned to the house by the same route, closing the window behind her. She had washed the razor and replaced it. She had washed her hands and the nightdress she had worn. She had gone to bed. As to why, she would say nothing that satisfied anyone. She told Wagner that she bore no hatred for the child. She repeated in every statement she gave that her half-brother had done her no wrong. She told the prison chaplain that she had acted from a spirit of revenge, but she would not say against whom, and she would not describe the course of thought that had brought her to the act. She would maintain this silence for the next 79 years. She never recanted. She never expanded. She went to her grave with the heart of the matter kept back. The questions that surrounded her confession were raised immediately and have not subsided in the century and a half since. The first was the physical improbability of a slightly built 16-year-old girl carrying a sleeping 3-year-old boy, wrapped in a blanket, down 2 flights of stairs and across a wet lawn, without waking the child or being heard by any member of a household of 12. The second was the absence of any trace of blood on the stairs, in the drawing room, on the lawn, or on any article of clothing recovered from the house. The third was the absence of any evidence that Constance had possessed the physical strength to inflict a wound of the severity that had killed Savile, a wound described by Dr. Parsons as having severed the windpipe and carried the blade to the vertebrae. The fourth, and the one to which the most serious attention has been given, was the role of her brother William. William Savile Kent was 14 years old at the time of the murder. He was small for his age, slightly built, delicate in health, and the only surviving son of the first marriage. He had always been close to his sister Constance. the pair of them having been thrown together as the youngest children of their mother's long and unhappy decline. The two of them had run away from home together at the ages of 12 and 10. They had spoken of travelling to Bristol and taking ship abroad. They had been caught together and punished together. In the years that followed, Constance had been sent to school at Beckington, William to boarding school at Bath. Their attachment to one another was remarked on by the family's servants. Wiltshire, in his notes, had suspected from an early stage that William was an accomplice, or at least a confidant of Constance. He had not been able to pursue the suspicion because the magistrates had required him to make his case against Constance alone. Modern scholarship on the case, and in particular the work of Kate Summerscale in her study, The Suspicions of Mr. Wiltshire, has drawn fresh attention to William. Summerscale notes that the physical demands of the murder, the carrying of the child, the inflicting of the mortal wound, the disposal of the body in the vault, are demands more readily met by two people than by one. She notes that William, as a boy raised in the country, would have had easier access to the privy and a better knowledge of the outbuildings than his sister. She notes that the razor said to have been taken from Samuel Kent's dressing case was of a type that would have been familiar to the son of the house and unfamiliar to a daughter confined to the upper stories. She notes above all that the motive for the murder, if any motive existed beyond that of revenge against the father who had turned away from the children of his first marriage, was a motive that William shared with his sister to the full. Francis Savile Kent was the favourite child of Samuel Kent's second marriage. He was the heir to his father's affection. His murder was an act that struck at Samuel Kent through the thing Samuel Kent loved. Summerscale's conclusion, which is not hers alone, and has been shared by several writers on the case, is that William and Constance acted together, that Constance, in confessing alone and refusing to name her brother, discharged the final and deepest of the loyalties that had bound her to him since their shared childhood. Whether this is the truth, or whether it is simply the most plausible construction that can be placed on a confession that always refused to admit of any construction, cannot now be determined. What can be said is that William Savile Kent went on to a distinguished career as a marine biologist. He published a standard work on the anemones and corals of the British Isles. He emigrated to Australia. He served as Inspector of Fisheries for Queensland and for Western Australia. He was elected a Fellow of the Linnean Society and of the Zoological Society. He lived to be 63. He never married. He never spoke of his sister in public or in any surviving correspondence. When Constance was finally released from prison, William was already in the Southern Hemisphere, at the other end of the earth from her. Constance served her sentence at Millbank, at Parkhurst, and at Woking Convict Prison. She was released on licence in 1885, at the age of 41, having served 20 years. Of her time in prison, almost nothing is known. There were stories, repeated in the popular press, that she had made mosaic panels for church sanctuaries at Chichester, East Grinstead, and St. Paul's in London. The stories cannot be confirmed. What can be confirmed is that on her release, she was placed briefly in the custody of Arthur Wagner in Brighton, and that within a year she had left England. She travelled to Tasmania, where William had taken up a post as Superintendent of Fisheries, and from Tasmania she travelled to Sydney, and from Sydney to the town of Maitland in New South Wales. She changed her name to Ruth Emily Kay. She trained as a nurse. In 1898, she took up the post of matron at the Pierce Memorial Nurses' Home in East Maitland, a lying-in hospital for the poor women of the district. She held the post for 21 years. She was known in Maitland for her gentleness with frightened young mothers, her firmness with junior staff, her habit of wearing a silver cross, and her complete silence on the subject of her own past. She retired in 1932 at the age of 88. She died in Sydney on April 10th, 1944, 1 month after her 100th birthday. She had outlived every other person connected to the murder by more than half a century. The question of what actually took place in Road Hill House on the night of June 29, 1860, has been the subject of more than a dozen book-length studies, 2 major parliamentary debates, and a series of legal reforms that changed the conduct of English criminal investigation. The case forced the magistrates of England to confront, for the first time in a case involving a respectable household, the question of whether the presumption of innocence should operate differently for the landed and the labouring classes. It established the principle, articulated by Lord Chief Justice Cockburn in his later writings on criminal procedure, that the whole of a household must be searched and questioned at the earliest opportunity in any case of domestic murder, regardless of the social standing of its members. It prompted a parliamentary debate on the question of priest-penitent privilege after Wagner's refusal to testify as to the content of Constance's confession under the seal of sacramental confession, a debate that ended with Lord Westbury's pronouncement that no such privilege existed in English law. It ruined the career of Jack Wiltshire, who died in 1881, aged 66, his reputation only partially restored in his final years by the respectful attention of Wilkie Collins, who had used him as a model for Sergeant Cuff in The Moonstone. Collins's novel, published in 1868, was the first full-length detective novel in English. It belongs to a line of literature that runs directly from Road Hill House through the works of Arthur Conan Doyle to the country house mysteries of Agatha Christie and the golden age of detective fiction. The template of the closed household, the murder within, the outside investigator whose arrival disturbs the surface of respectability, the false lead, the overlooked clue, the slow unravelling of a family's secrets, all of these were present in the Road Hill case before they were present in any novel. The fictional detective is, in an important sense, the long shadow of Jonathan Wiltshire. The country house mystery is the long shadow of Road Hill House. The Kent family, in the years after the conviction, scattered and sank from view. Samuel Kent moved his remaining family to Wales, where he died in 1872 at the age of 71. Mary Kent, the second wife, survived him by some years and died in obscurity. The surviving daughters of the first marriage, Mary Ann Alice and Elizabeth, who had been in the house on the night of the murder and had been questioned briefly by the local police and dismissed, never married. They lived together in lodgings in the south of England and died within a few years of one another. The children of the second marriage, Mary Amelia, Evelyn, Ackland, and Florence, grew up under the shadow of the case. Ackland, the boy born 4 weeks after his brother's death, emigrated to Canada. Florence became a schoolmistress. None of them, so far as the surviving records show, ever spoke of Savile. The name of the dead child, carved on a small stone in the churchyard of the Holy Trinity at Rode, was not mentioned in the family. Road Hill House itself still stands. The village in which it sits has changed its name. In 1919, the inhabitants of Rode, weary of the association between their parish and the crime that had been committed there nearly 60 years before, petitioned for the name to be altered. It has since been known as Road, with an E, so that the traveller arriving by the modern road from Frome may pass through it without any clear notion that it is the same place. The house was renamed Langham House by its new owners in the 1860s and has changed hands several times in the years since. It is a private residence. The orchard has been subdivided. The privy in which Savile was found has long since been demolished. The drawing room window through which, by her own account, Constance carried the child out into the wet summer night has been glazed and reglazed and presents no trace of what once passed across its sill. The historian Bernard Taylor, writing in 1979, visited the house and walked the grounds. He noted the distance from the nursery window to the privy as precisely 65 yards. He noted that the route passed in full view of the rear windows of the master bedroom. He noted that on a still summer night, with the windows of the house open and the watchdog loose in the yard, the passage of a woman carrying a child across that ground without making a sound and without being heard was a feat that could be accomplished only by someone who knew the house as well as anyone living in it. In his account of the case, Taylor advanced the same conclusion that Wiltshire had reached in the fortnight of July 1860, and that had been reached again, independently, by every serious student of the case since. The murderer of Francis Savile Kent lived in the house. The murderer was known to the child. The murderer carried him out, killed him and came back, and walked up the stairs to bed and slept. The case of Savile Kent exemplifies something that has troubled students of Victorian crime ever since. The respectable household, with its walls and its high gates and its bolted doors, was not a refuge. It was in many cases the trap from which the victim could not escape. The 3-year-old who slept between his nurse's bed and the wall in a room at the top of a locked and guarded house was not protected by those walls. He was confined by them, in the company of whoever it was that meant him harm. The outside intruder, the figure of the stranger climbing through the drawing-room window, was an invention of Samuel Kent's first instinct and Superintendent Foley's first report, and it was an invention because it was easier to accept than the truth. The truth was that the child had been killed by someone who had lain down to sleep under the same roof that night and had risen from sleep the following morning and had eaten breakfast and had spoken to the servants and had joined in the search. Dr. Angela Buckley, writing in 2022, observes that the Road Hill case was the first great English murder to be fully covered by the national daily press in the modern manner. The readers of the Times and the Morning Post in July 1860 followed the investigation day by day, read the floor plan of the house, memorized the positions of the bedrooms, formed their own theories, took sides, and argued in their clubs and drawing rooms. It was the first murder about which the ordinary reader felt himself to be, in a small way, a detective. Kate Summerscale argues that this was the birth of a particular kind of modern consciousness, the consciousness of the reader as investigator, of the private life of the household as the proper object of public curiosity, of the body of the victim as the starting point of a story that could be solved. The consciousness, in other words, of the age we still live in. What Wiltshire saw in the house, and what the magistrates at Trowbridge in July 1860 would not let him establish, has been confirmed by every serious examination of the evidence since. The murder was committed from within. The murderer was shielded by the family, and, at a deeper level, by the conventions of the society in which the family moved. A teenage girl from a respectable country house could not, in the summer of 1860, be convicted of the murder of her own half-brother on the evidence of a missing nightdress, even when every other consideration pointed to her guilt. It took 5 years, a religious crisis, and a high church clergyman's refusal to put her forward for confirmation to produce a confession. It took the confession to produce a conviction. The conviction itself satisfied few. The magistrate who received the confession doubted it. The Home Secretary who commuted the sentence doubted it. The press, having first attacked Constance, then defended her, then attacked her again, never settled on whether she had told the full truth. She lived for another 79 years and told no one. There are cases in the history of English crime in which the evidence is clear and the law follows. There are cases in which the evidence is unclear and the law fails. The case of Savile Kent belongs to a third category. It is a case in which the evidence was clear in its direction from the earliest hours, was set aside for reasons of social deference, and had to be retrieved 5 years later by a confession that did not fully match the facts it was meant to explain. It is a case in which the criminal investigation was defeated not by the cleverness of the criminal, but by the slowness of the system to admit that crime could walk in the gardens of the respectable. It is also a case in which the truth, so far as the truth can be reconstructed, is probably simpler and crueler than any of the theories that have been built around it. A household of adults and half-siblings, unequal in the father's affections, pregnant with old resentments, exploded into violence against the child who stood, by no fault of his own, at the centre of the father's love. The wound was not struck at Savile. It was struck at the man who had held him up in preference to the elder children, who had displaced the memory of the first wife with the person of the second, who had built walls around his new family while turning his back on the old. The child was the instrument by which the wound was delivered. It has been said of certain murders that they solve themselves the moment one stops asking who had the means and starts asking who had the grievance. The Road Hill case is of that kind. The question of who could have taken the child from the cot was a question that allowed of several answers. The question of who had, living in that house, the settled and sufficient reason to want the second Mrs. Kent's favourite child dead, allowed in the end of only two, the younger son of the first marriage and the younger daughter. Wiltshire worked his way to that conclusion in a fortnight. He was destroyed for having reached it. The conclusion waited 5 years for a confession and another century and a half for the scholarship that would confirm it. In the churchyard of the Holy Trinity at East Coulston, where Samuel Kent's first wife, Mary Ann, is buried, there stands a small headstone to Francis Savile Kent. The inscription describes him as the dearly loved son of Samuel Savile and Mary Drew Kent, who was cruelly murdered at Rode on the 30th of June 1860, aged 3 years and 10 months. The word cruelly, cut in the stone by a local mason in the summer of 1860, is the only comment the family ever made on the manner of his death. Savile lies in the same grave as his half-brother Edward, the firstborn son of his father's first marriage, who had died in infancy in 1832, 28 years before Savile was born. The two boys, one the first son of the first wife, one the second son of the second, share the small plot. Over them Samuel Kent would eventually be buried in 1872, having spent the final 12 years of his life in a silence almost as complete as his daughter's. Jack Wiltshire died 9 years after Samuel Kent, in 1881. He was buried at Brompton Cemetery in West London. His obituary in the Illustrated Police News, a paper that had been among his harshest critics in 1860, described him as the finest detective officer of his generation, whose career had been unjustly cut short by a single case in which he had been entirely in the right. The obituary did not name the case. Constance Kent survived them all. She lived through the reigns of Victoria, Edward, George V, and into the wartime government of Winston Churchill. She read her morning paper in Sydney in 1944 in the last weeks of her life, and saw that the armies of Britain were once again fighting in France, as they had been fighting in her grandfather's time. She had been born in the reign of William IV. She had been buried alive at 16 in a scandal that the whole English-speaking world had followed. She had served 20 years in the prisons of a vanished penal system, had travelled to the far side of the world under an assumed name, had nursed 4 generations of poor women through their confinements, had been respected in her adopted town as a woman of exceptional discretion, and had never, in any forum, added a single word to the confession she had made to the chief magistrate at Bow Street in April 1865. What she had said then, what she had said in court at Salisbury 3 months later, and what she said in her long life afterwards, added up to the same thing. She alone had done it. No one had assisted her. There was no more to say. Whether this was the truth in full or the truth in part, or the truth as she had agreed to tell it with the brother she never saw again in this life, is a matter on which the historical record has room for doubt, and on which Constance herself left no room at all. The evidence of what happened in the small hours of the 30th of June, 1860, in a locked country house in the valley of the Frome, is now as complete as it is ever going to be. The body of the child was found in the privy. The privy is gone. The nightdress was never produced. The razor was washed and returned to its case. The shutters of the drawing-room window were opened by someone who knew the house. The watchdog did not bark. The family, for the rest of their lives, did not speak of it. The detective who saw the shape of it was driven out of his profession. The girl who confessed to it kept the deeper part of it to herself and took it with her to a grave on the other side of the world. What remains is the house, renamed, the village, renamed, the graves of the Kents, scattered between Somerset, Wiltshire, Wales, and New South Wales. A confession that answered the question of guilt and left the question of motive open. A legal reform on the law of confession. A literary tradition that runs from Wilkie Collins to the present day. And a small, nearly decapitated body, lifted from a stone-lined vault by a village shoemaker and a labourer in the early light of a wet summer morning, and laid on a shutter and carried back into the house and set down in the breakfast room, while the man who had installed the high gates around his orchard stood by and said nothing, and the son and the daughter of his first marriage watched from the head of the stairs, and the pregnant second wife wept, and somewhere above them, in a nursery that had been left unattended for perhaps 20 minutes of the long night, a cot stood empty, with its sheet and its counterpane undisturbed, as though the child who had slept there had simply got up and walked away.